Yeah, so I also trained as an architect. I'd like to think that I'm still practicing architecture. Architecture is the discipline that I'm kind of committed to contributing to. I can understand if there's a bit of dispute over whether what I do constitutes architecture, but what I'm really trying to grapple with is this question of how do people relate to each other and the spaces around them? How do we design? How do we build our spaces? I'm going to be talking about mutually assured construction. The thing is, things are changing, right? Things are changing and will change quite drastically over the next couple of decades. They're changing for a variety of reasons. Things are changing at a faster pace than I think we've ever been faced with before, both in a geological sense. It's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah. Both in an environmental sense and in a technological sense. We have the capacity to affect our world at a faster rate than ever before, but at the same time, the effects that things like climate change are going to have on us are happening at a much faster rate. And so the question that concerns me, that I really want to throw out for debate and discussion is, how do we want things to change? How do we actually decide what it is that we should do and how we should respond to the changing situation? Who gets to decide? Who gets to design? Who gets to make these decisions on behalf of probably quite a lot of humanity? What is the role of the designer in this kind of situation? That's the question that I'm obsessed with and that every one of my projects is trying to explore in some way. And recently I've been using this kind of phrase, mutually assured construction, to describe the kind of work that I'm doing. If I go back for a second, is everyone familiar with the idea of mutually assured destruction? This was a phrase used a lot in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Not so much recently until Trump and Korea decided to trade words. But just to describe it, this is the principle. It was a Cold War strategy, which basically said that if both sides have nuclear weapons, if both sides have the capacity to destroy each other, neither side has the incentive either to initiate a conflict or, in fact, to disarm. If they send weapons, if they fire on a country further away, that country has enough time to fire back and destroy you. And so there's no incentive to actually to destroy that country. So this was the principle of the Cold War that essentially led to stalemate. Nothing happened. Nobody actually did attack anyone else, at least at the nuclear scale. But at the same time, nobody really was incentivized to disarm either. If you unpack this is part of game theory. You can start to look at the prisoner's dilemmas aspects of all of this. I want to look at the opposite of that, really. It's what I call mutually assured construction. And this is a strategy in a similar kind of way to harness our mutual incentives to figure out how do we actually take these prisoner's dilemma conflicts or these apparent disinclination to work together to actually build and act and decide together to do stuff, even though there isn't consensus. And I would put it to you that this is actually possible. It is possible to collaborate without having consensus. And that's the kind of thing that I'm exploring with this idea of mutually assured construction. Essentially, the idea is that we design a system in such a way that anyone's contribution helps somebody else to contribute as well. That's the kind of the general principle. It's also based on this idea that we don't have some perfect image that has been determined by a single person that we're then trying to work towards. I think Heartbeat is a good example of this. It's a product of the collaboration and the conflicts as well as the agreements that are encountered along the way. So I think there is a possibility to sort of to design systems for this kind of collaboration without consensus, but it's of course quite difficult to figure out how to harness the frictions of participation to mutual benefit. So my interest as a designer is really this question: how do you structure participation in order to take that kind of friction and actually make it mutually beneficial? Figuring out through that process who gets to decide, who makes the decisions. How do you open up that process of design so that if you've designed X, somebody else designs Y and reappropriates, reconfigures, kind of takes on the framework that you've created. One of my references is Heinz von Fürster, and so this is a kind of an adaptation of something he said. But essentially, my interest in design is how can I design to increase the number of choices, not to determine an outcome, which is a single outcome, but rather to implement a system that results in the greatest number of possible outcomes when other people start to work with it, take it on, and take it further. So there's a fundamental aspect to being interested in the structures of participation, which is essentially to accept that your design process will be completely taken over by somebody else and turned into something very different that you may or may not agree with. And this is just something that you have to get used to, not being precious about your design. And perhaps there's some echoes to the previous conversation in precisely this. So the question is, why does this even matter? Why does it matter to think about design as a process and design as an open process in particular? Why does it matter that we need to be thinking about involving more people in design? For me, this is not just some sort of, oh, it's so nice if we all collaborate kind of thing. This is because the only way I think that we are going to get through the next few decades is by implementing this kind of collaborative approach through which we collectively decide what future we want, design it, and implement it. Even if we don't all agree with the exact outcome, we have to find a way to get through these next few decades. The situation we're in is actually pretty bleak, and I want to spend just a few minutes just kind of painting this picture, and then I'll get into some projects to show how I'm trying to find ways that we can work past this. First of all, we're existing in a situation where our democracies, things are being decided largely by those who don't participate in the democracy. You know, things like Brexit, things like the US elections were mostly decided by the people that didn't vote. You know, the greater number of people did not vote than actually voted for any specific issue or candidate. So our very democratic structures, I think, are under transformation. In terms of the environment, the effects that climate change are going to have on the very fabric of our cities, even if sea levels rise only by a small amount, they're going to redraw the boundaries of our cities, especially those cities that are built around any type of river that has sea access. And in many cases, that will disproportionately affect those who are least able to just get on a plane and move. In London in particular, you can see the poorest boroughs tend to be the red ones. Those are the ones that are right around the river. These are people who are going to discover that they don't have land to live on. And this was me looking at a 5-meter rise, which is the conservative estimate for the end of the century in terms of sea level rise. If you read Kim Stanley Robinson's book, New York 2140, he's looking at 2140. He's looking at a 50-meter sea level rise, which dramatically changes the face of the city. This is already happening. We're already seeing in Miami that parking garages are routinely flooded. So this is happening now. We were actually the structures of our cities are actually being transformed as we speak. Then you kind of like throw into this what's going on in the financial world without getting sort of too caught up in this. If you look at the fact that global debt is way beyond anything it's ever been before, when you look at the introduction of cryptocurrencies, which is essentially, you know, other ways of transacting, when you look at the way that our corporations that we live with and thrive on in many senses, and their ability to effectively evade their responsibility for contributing to the societies on which they're thriving. And when you throw in that, the fact that even hedge fund managers these days, I mean, I'm talking about right now, hedge fund managers are planning for the end of fiat money. So fiat money essentially means that idea that you can kind of transact in an arbitrary good. Financial managers are actually planning over the next decades that money as we know it is going to be a completely different system. And given that largely our world is structured according to kind of capitalist processes, the very nature of how these sorts of things are determined is at the core level going to transform. Again, the question is, what do we do about this as designers? Now, there is one approach that says, oh, don't worry, because technology is going to save everything. Technology will be able to kind of help us out past this situation. And of course, the smart city paradigm is something that's often talked about, particularly in the urban context. Here's a shot of the operations center in Rio. In most cases, these smart cities are essentially premised on the idea of monitoring and observation and...
Sorry, it's cropped a bit. I think you need to
I've got a 16:9 presentation, so I think it's getting stretched here. In most cases, these smart city systems are essentially being designed in terms of surveillance, measuring, data gathering exercises. Now, when we have these kinds of technological systems, as we start to bring in these kind of smart city technologies, I think we have to understand that along with that vision, that kind of panopticon vision of being able to control and manage the city, there are things that we're already seeing through these processes that give some indication of what's coming next. So if this is the smart city, then so too is the NSA and the PRISM being able to collect your data. That's part of the smart city too. So too is the idea that your data is captured by web services and possibly leaked, the Ashley Madison leak. So too is the idea that a car company can deceive us about the data that's being gathered on our own health behalf. That's part of the smart city. It's part of the smart city that Tesla can go and beta test their features on the road, even though they haven't quite figured out how it's best going to be, what's actually best for us. It's part of the smart city that a 15-year-old can hack into a telco and access data. It's part of the city that, the smart city that Mark Zuckerberg actually thinks it was kind of crazy to think that fake news influenced voting in the US election. All of these things are part of the technological infrastructure that's being put into our cities right now. And these are being put in largely, I would say, on behalf of very large technology companies whose business it is to tell you that the city is a problem that can be solved through technology. That is their business model. So these technologies largely are making decisions and effectively designing our future on our behalf. And so, again, I'd like to echo the previous presentation. The question is, how do we, as human beings, as people who are actually give a damn about the future, actually make those decisions and implement the kind of future that we think that we want? In fact, how do we even figure out what it is that we want? I would posit that it's through this idea of mutually assured construction, that we design systems in such a way that they only work if we work together. Now, that could mean that actually everything fails. We never get to work together and everything collapses and we don't actually find the future. But I would argue that the only way we're going to get to the future in any case is if we work together to find it, if we work together to create that future. In fact, it's the only kind of future that I'm particularly interested in, is one in which we are actually working and designing and acting together. So the first aspect of mutually assured construction is this idea of figuring out how do we get people to design together, to collaborate together, even if they don't have consensus. There's ways to do this, and I'm going to show a few projects very briefly afterwards to show you through this. The second is structure things so that we make decisions together. What you're trying to do is weave in a shared responsibility for this collective future. They might not be big decisions. You might not be getting people to make a single big decision, but you're getting people to make these micro decisions and investing their own responsibility in what the outcome is. And then finally, you get people to act together. You figure out how to structure a system so that people are actually acting upon the world and effectively kind of both building a sense of accomplishment, but also building in that sense of accountability. They did something to the world, they're going to take responsibility for it. It's their act upon that world. And so all of these things are aspects that I'm trying to test in the various projects, which I'm now going to get to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through those three categories: design together, decide together, and act together, and just illustrate the way I've been trying to explore these different things in specific projects. I'm going to start with a very old project from 2006, and I'm going to go quite quickly through these just to kind of illustrate the core idea. Open Burble was something I did in Singapore, where essentially we created a modular system, carbon fiber, balloons, sensors, that members of the public could come together, assemble like a Lego kit, and essentially create a structure 18 stories tall in the middle of the public space in the center of Singapore. So this structure, which is essentially it's actually a very large cellular automata. The way that the colors mix through this entire structure is explicitly determined by the way that all the hundreds of people that collaborated in designing and assembling it actually put it together. They're holding on to this structure. If they let go, it's their responsibility to hold on to this 18-story structure. And that's, again, a part of this process, is that you're actually building into the system that they are responsible for not letting go of this thing. These are just a few more pictures to kind of give you a sense of that scale. And it's a bit dark, but you kind of get the idea. Another project I did was called Assemblance. This was about 3 years ago. You'll also notice that I'm kind of going from the temporary cultural all the way to the permanent infrastructural on the other end. I'm going to be going through from very short-term stuff to much longer-term stuff towards the end of the talk. So Assemblance was essentially a project looking at using light as a material to construct with. We were using lasers and we were positioning them in three-dimensional space. And really the idea here was to figure out how to build an interface that anyone can draw structures in space with their hands and their gestures and their bodies. But the structures that they built together with other people were more resilient. In other words, if you build a structure on your own, then it's very fragile and anyone bumping into it will smash it. But if you build a structure while holding hands with somebody or collaboratively build the shape together, that structure is much more robust and doesn't kind of collapse when somebody walks into it. So here you can kind of see some shots of the interface where somebody's actually drawing with their hand and creating the walls and the different kind of shapes in three-dimensional space. This was, for us, it was a bit of a kind of almost like a sandbox for creating three-dimensional forms, one in which it was an actual physical space. This was not a kind of an augmented reality, but it was one where actually the space itself was shared by many people who were in that space and kind of scripting in 3 dimensions. A few more shots. Flight Path Toronto was a project for the City of Toronto back in 2011, where essentially I was invited to do a project in the city center, Nathan Phillips Square, and I was interested to look at basically redesigning an urban transportation system that was somewhat inspired by the birds, but also one in which members of the public could get involved in designing and deciding what the paths of transportation would actually look like. You know, one of the problems with designing in cycle lanes and bus routes and things like that is usually it's an incredibly long process. It's sort of a 10-year process to consult with people, to then implement something that's very disruptive. I wanted to look at a way to be able to redesign public transport in the city center and to be able to do that very rapidly so that people could actually make decisions about the lines that they wanted to take, test them out, and then rapidly reconfigure if necessary. This was a collaboration with the artist and engineer Natalie Jeremijenko, and what we ended up doing was basically using zip lines across the city center as a way to get people moving. So it's something that's fast, it's fun, it's emission emissionless. And what's really interesting is that you can quickly deploy a line, and then if it's not in the right place, you can redeploy it somewhere else. What we ended up doing basically was giving people wings so that they could fly across the city center and try this out, so that it actually became as much a spectacular kind of engagement with it as it was a sort of a public transportation mechanism. We were trying to basically take inspiration from the birds and who really explore the city in 3 dimensions and get them involved in kind of rethinking what 3-dimensional space is in the city. So again, this was about getting people to design these sorts of things together. It's okay if you get the line wrong, you just redirect it somewhere else much quicker than you could with a bus lane or a cycle. So the next section is all about deciding together. How do you structure something so people make decisions and essentially kind of weave in that notion of a shared responsibility for the future? Natural Fuse was a project that has now actually been around the world in a number of different cities, but essentially what it was a, where's my audio here? Do I have audio? Yes. It's basically a plant with a power socket on it. And the idea is that the plant offsets the carbon footprint of anything that you plug into it. So the more that the plant grows, the more it sequesters carbon and offsets the energy usage of the device that's been plugged into it. Now the catch is that even a low wattage lamp needs 6 plants to offset its carbon footprint, especially when you factor in the production cost of creating the unit itself, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens is when you switch on the device, it wakes up and it looks for 5 other units out in the city to see if there are 5 units that are not currently being used to offset carbon footprint. If there are 5 units out there, then you can borrow their carbon sequestering capacity to offset against your energy usage, and you can switch your light on. Now, what you actually have is you have a choice, because let's say there's only 2 or 3 units out there that are currently not being used. You won't have enough to offset your carbon footprint. What will then happen is it'll switch off your light before you harm the carbon footprint of the community as a whole. But sometimes you absolutely must have light. You know, you might hear an intruder in your flat and you need to switch on your light. In that case, you can actually choose to be selfish. You'll get as much energy as you need. But if you end up harming the carbon footprint of the community, it sends a kill signal out to kill somebody else's plant through a vinegar injection. The idea is that you can act selfishly, but you know it's going to have a detrimental effect on the community as a whole. Now, in practice, the way we do this is we give every plant 3 lives. And before actually administering the injection, both the one who switched it on and the person whose plant is being about to be injected, they each get an email and they get into a conversation, and they can explain to each other, you know, well, I had to do this because I had to make this decision because I heard someone or what have you. The idea here is that you build into this system the capacity to defect, in the language of game theory, to act selfishly. But if you act selfishly, there is this kind of chain of accountability. If you're going to build a participatory system, you must be able to factor in selfish behavior within it. And that was kind of key to this project. Cinder was a more recent project for a school in Cambridge, which is about an hour away from London. And this was a new school in a new community with people moving in that didn't really know each other. It was a very high-tech building with lots of sensors. There was a building management system that was measuring everything. There were sustainability technologies. There were solar panels on the roof. And we were basically tasked with figuring out how to make the incoming students feel as though it was their school. What we ended up doing, basically, and this was a sort of almost a 3-year process of working with the students that were going to be coming into this school, is we figured out a way to take the building management system and basically turn it into a cat. So this cat, whose name is Cinder, responds to the building management system data, the environmental data, the energy usage, data from around the school. It changes size, it changes color, it changes behavior. And each of these things are about learning about the building management systems data that's being generated. You see it on a kind of an augmented reality mirror where you can actually interact with this 3D being. It was the students themselves that designed Cinder, that kind of gave Cinder her name, that basically designed what she looked like and how she behaved. We were making a lot of references here to the Matrix and the glitch in the Matrix, and of course projects like Flirt by Fiona Raby and her team. So that's in the main space. But when Cinder gets hungry, she goes hunting on the network, and she pops up onto one student's laptop, and she begs for food. That student at that moment then it has this ability to decide how much food to feed Cinder, and the amount of food that's available to feed Cinder is based on how much energy has been generated by the solar panels today. So the idea is that that student, who's about 10 years old, is making a decision about the resource allocation for the cat on the basis of their understanding of what the weather's been like today, how much the sun has been out, or what have you. So there is this kind of there's this kind of engagement with Cinder, who's a creature that they've been part of creating. But they also have to make this quite fundamental decision, and they have to make that in the light of knowing that if they make one decision, then if Cinder needs food later on and they've given her too much, then the next student might not be able to feed her as well. So that's going to be there, supposed to be there for the next 20 years. So we'll see what happens as technology adapts and Cinder starts to appear in all sorts of different ways. So finally, act together. This is all about getting people to act and do something in the world together, to kind of leave behind, if you like, a kind of a sense of accomplishment. I'm going to start with WhereAQ, which is actually one of our most recent projects on air quality. And here, what we did is, there's loads of air quality data out there. There's loads of visualizations for what's going on in our cities. What we wanted to do was to say, okay, how do we get people involved in that process of making sense of the air quality data or the air quality situation in their cities? The problem with the sensors that are deployed in our cities at the moment is, first of all, they're telling us stuff that we kind of already know. We know where pollution is. We tend to know where that is. The data also doesn't give us any information that we can act on. Sometimes people say, well, if you build a map of clean air, then you can take a longer route to work or to school, and you can walk through the park where the air is fresher. But there's plenty of research that's shown that actually if you spend more time outdoors exposed by taking a longer, supposedly cleaner route, you're actually exposed to worse particulates along that route. Most people can't just move if they are living in an area of poor air quality. So the question is, what is the role of people in making sense of the pollution and what's going on outside? What we wanted to do, this was just the beginning of a project that's actually going to take 3 years. What we basically wanted to do was work with, in this case, young people, go out into the city and see what they sensed, what they intuitively sensed was the air quality as they explored the different neighborhoods. So rather than taking a digital sensor and just saying, well, it's 3.2 here, we wanted to look at what human beings sense or understand, or how they make sense of what they think the air quality situation is. We created this wearable. Ling Tan, who's the senior designer in Umbrellium here, led this project. She created a wearable which essentially tracked people's gestures, and then they went out exploring around the school neighborhoods and just tried to perform what they thought the air quality was like. Is it really good? Is it really bad? Is it sort of so-so? And at the same time, we took a very expensive air quality monitor, which is about sort of 10,000 euros. And essentially our experiment was to say, do people predict where air quality is worst? Can people perform as well as a digital sensor in intuitively knowing where the air quality is bad? And our hypothesis essentially for the longer project is that we don't need air quality sensors to get a high resolution map of air quality data in the city, that you can take things like traffic and temperature and noise level combined with humans' innate perception of the city, and you have much better, much cheaper, much more reliable, and much more engaging air quality sense making. And so this was, as I said, it was just the first step in what's going to be a 3-year project. So all we were doing really was testing out the proof of concept. They went out, and the idea here again is that it's not just about somebody measuring a value and then putting it into a map. It's about just as much about that performance of a group of 20 students standing on a street corner next to a construction site right next to their school and holding their noses because they know the air quality is bad. It's that effect that it has on people seeing that measuring is going on and that there's this assessment going on and that they're going to be held accountable to it. This is about people actually creating data, yes, but also doing that in a public way that people should be held accountable to.
Perception is
I'm going to refer to an old project, Patch Bay here, which I know some of you might have seen before, but I wanted to talk about what happened in Japan in 2011 after the radiation crisis. So Patch Bay was something I launched about now about 10 years ago, which was one of the first Internet of Things general data infrastructures. And it was essentially a worldwide community of people building connected objects and sensors and air quality monitors, energy devices, sharing that data basically. At one stage we were handling about 100 million data points per day from all these different kinds of devices that were around the world. Where it was most interesting to me was what happened in Japan following the disaster at Fukushima, when concerned citizens were desperately trying to get hold of data about what was going on, and the government was not able to release that information in a way that was useful to them. And very quickly the Patch Bay community across Japan mobilized to connect sensors, their radiation monitors, to the web and start sharing that data in real time, so that within a couple of weeks after the disaster, there were about 2,000 feeds across the country, some of which were generating data every second. But what came next was actually the most interesting thing to me, which was the stuff that people did with that data. So this was a map interface created by Haiyan Zhang, which was essentially mapping not just the radiation levels, but what the radiation level combined with exposure time, what health effects that would have. Nobody else had done this yet. The government hadn't been able to communicate that actually radiation level is not the thing that harms you, it's your exposure time to particular levels that is harmful. There were kind of visualizations that looked at where the current hotspots of radiation were across the country. There were visualizations that the community made that looked at where the trends of radiation data seemed to indicate there would be problems. There was the Winds of Fukushima Android app where somebody took wind sensor data from Patch Bay, combined it with radiation data to predict where where the radiation peaks would then move to based on wind. And so on and so forth. It was basically the community coming together to mobilize around this data to create all sorts of ways of making sense of that data. If you didn't have a radiation monitor of your own, you could put an SMS alert onto your neighbor's radiation monitor. If you didn't have a connected Geiger counter, then you could just type the numbers into a web interface that somebody created. There was a lot of criticism of this data because it was not, it was not scientifically valid in the sense of having been measured by exactly the same device with exactly the same process and oriented in exactly the same way. But this was not a process of trying to create an objectively analyzable data set. This was people trying to make sense of what was going on in their own neighborhoods, where really the only thing they were concerned about is it higher here, or is it going up over time, or is it going down over time? And how can I start to do stuff in response. Two more projects just to wrap up with. VoiceOver was a project from a couple of years ago where we worked in a community up in North England where it had largely been kind of left off of the technological development that's been implemented in a number of cities in Britain. The idea of there being smart city technology here would just never have occurred to most people. What we ended up doing basically was creating, and this was again a 3-year process to figure out what was the project in conjunction with the local residents. What we ended up doing basically was creating this radically public communication network where people could talk with each other, where the sound actually passed through everyone's living room, and where the path that sound takes is dependent on who decides they want to be part of the project. Essentially, it's a peer-to-peer network where people were using the technology, the kind of kit of parts, as an excuse to talk to their neighbor, to say, look, can you be part of this network so that we can start talking to the street next to us, because we need one more node in this network to be able to reach across to the other side of the town. Again, it was quite a long project, but the key really was that once this infrastructure was in place, the question of what it's used for, what do people use to talk about, what are the kind of reminiscences or the stories that people have, you know, the kind of, there was a proposal to use this thing as for bedtime stories for people across the town, for idle chat, for political conversation, for religious conversation, and what have you. As you speak, your voice kind of is turned into this kind of light beam that bounces down the street. You basically can see where your audio is going to and where the audio is coming from. You can follow both the sounds as well as the path of that sound.
My name is Joe.
So this kind of gives you a bit of an idea of what it was like looking down the street. This was not a very spectacular project. It was just about, it was mostly about people who had never really talked very much together, didn't know each other, to come together to be part of a very large conversation. It actually uncovered the fact that 3 cousins who didn't even know they were all living next to each other finally met each other. So ultimately what it really was about was the kind of conversations that were created and the relationships that kind of lasted from this process. It actually got people out in the streets, talking together, performing together, making decisions about their city together, and the technology itself almost became irrelevant, except that it was an excuse to get together. And I'm just going to finish with Thingful. Thingful is basically a search engine for the Internet of Things. There is loads of open data around the world being generated in real time that people have explicitly made open and available to others. But it's really hard to find. You know, you can't really Google for IoT data, you can't Google for the nearest air quality monitor. So we basically created the search engine as a way for you to find the data that's out there that people already want you to use. So, for example, if you search for air quality in central London, you can see there's quite a few air quality monitors, all on different networks. On the AQICN network, Intel has something, I'm sure the Smart Citizen has something, the Air Quality Egg has something. When you click on any individual device that you've found, you can then go to the original data source and access its data directly. If you're not interested in air quality, it might be radiation in Germany, earthquakes in California, there is wave height in the Pacific, there's even connected animals, there's connected sharks and turtles that you can get data from. All of these things can be found and accessed in real time. You can search and understand the data coming from cities. This is essentially aggregating from or indexing the data from many different networks and data sources, and then you can go and access that data that people want you to use because they've made it open, but which is just very difficult to discover. We've actually got a private beta launching at the end of October. It's called Data Pipes, and essentially what you'll be able to do is via the API is set up a pipe for the kind of data that you want. Let's say it's air quality in Paris, or it might be bike docks in Spain, or what have you, you can create a pipe and it'll pipe that data to your application or to your database or to your email address or wherever you need it. If you want to be part of that, you know, we'd love to know what you're planning to build with it. Email getstarted@thinkful.net and we'll add you to the private beta, which, as I said, should be launching in the next few weeks. So that's it, really. You know, there are ways, I think, to design for and to build for a situation where we don't all have a coherent idea of what the future is. We probably will never all agree, even in this room with like-minded individuals, what that future should be. But as designers, I think it's still possible to construct systems in such a way that we can collaborate without that consensus. Ultimately, it is all about building this shared memory of a possible future, a way that we can actually, with kind of intention, act upon that future. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Usman. That was from the deep dive in data and analyzing to a socially engaged future with data. Is there any questions from the audience?
Thank you. As an advocate of participatory design, you want to enable people to make their own design decisions. How do you see the role of professional designers then?
So, in a sense, when you're acting as a designer and you're concerned about these kind of participatory aspects, there's a certain amount of angst because you recognize that you make a design decision, you're effectively restricting what others can do. The way I try and deal with that is say, okay, first of all, when I make a design decision, what is the way that that decision can be overturned by someone else or re-scripted or reappropriated? And secondly, if I'm trying to decide between two different things, what is the thing that I can decide on that actually leads to the most possible of next steps, if you like, the greatest possible outcomes that I referred to at the beginning. There's a few other ways that I think that as a designer, you have to grapple with this fact that you are putting marks down in the world that essentially are inscribing other people. The question really for me is how to make those marks mutable and changeable, but not so floppy that they don't give something to somebody that they can actually build off of. In other words, it would be wrong to create a totally open system where people are like, I don't even know what to do here. I don't know where to start. But it's a completely open field, and I don't even know where to go or what I might do as a first thing. So as a participatory designer, what you're trying to essentially do is kind of make that mark and say, well, what if it was this? And what would you do if you were to redo that first step? Does that answer?
Quick question: Are you familiar with the churches that was built in Poland around the 70s and 80s, which were built as participatory designs? Directed through a communal design process of architects that would then go out into the community, assemble materials, what they had available, then do a fabrication process of that, and then build churches. If you're not familiar with it, then you should check it out because it's very much in sync with what you're talking about, as this we build together, we act together, and we design together. So it's more with the quick description I just gave, if that's a trajectory you could see that your own practice may go towards because you've been very committed to data and modeling and digital assemblages. If you're, as an architect, maybe interested in trying to have a communal-based design task of sorts where you build something in the physical realm on an, in lack of better words, architectural scale.
Yeah, I think that's definitely relevant, and it reminds me a lot of barn raising in the US, which was a way of a community coming together to build a home for a new resident who just moved into the town. So I think there's a number of these these manifestations. The idea of participatory design is not a new thing, really. You know, I mean, it's been with us for centuries. Really, I think what is new or what is more recent is this kind of privileging of the architect as the one who should be making the decisions alone. That's the odd thing to me, if you like. But I like that reference. I'll go and check some stuff out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Usman.
Thank you.